With patch 1.11, the most notable changes was the insane Bastion buff, as well as nerfs to popular control strategies such as Aurelion Soul and Radiant Guardian. Those small changes meant mostly the deck stayed the same in the meta, but there's still some drastic changes to the ranks in his actual video compared to my last top 10 list. There's also a few new additions too, so I'd love to see your thoughts on these decks. This is patch 1.11 top 10 decks based on win rate percentage. This video has been done in collaboration with Bomber TV. I'm going to give you a quick spoiler. This is the only survivor of the control decks that we had on the previous videos since the Targon release. The nerf to the Aurelion Soul and more importantly Radiant Guardian has meant increased strength in aggro strategies, meaning decks like this one in patch 1.11 have kind of effectively created the aggro meta. So this is a nice little control deck that's popped up with the Targon release that consists of Freljord champions and spells alongside 18 Shadow Isle spells. You'll notice that the deck is very spell heavy with a grand total of 27 spells. There's a very high average mana cost too, with a huge number of cards costing over 7 mana, and this must be what was somewhat of a record for high cost decks that I've actually reviewed. You can quickly get to late game with cards like Withering Stones and Catalyst of the Ions. To make up for your lack of followers, you can keep the Nexus healthy with cards like Grasp of the Undying and Withering Wail. In late game, you will slap your bombs, so think Trundle, Tryndamere, and War Mother's Call to bring out powerful cards using Overwhelm to basically hit as hard as possible. This deck is a breath of fresh air in a meta that has been quite stagnant for a while now. The buff to Bastion in patch 1.11 has shaken things up, hence new decks like this are starting to appear. This is your standard mid-range deck with a Targon twist throwing in an interesting dynamic to the archetype. The deck is a very strong ramp to mid-game with 24 cards costing 3 or less mana. The deck is actually fairly expensive with 6 epics in total. So why is this deck succeeding? Fiora has a much greater chance of surviving now as Bastion protects both her from combat tricks thanks to the 1/1 buff and from removals thanks to Spell Shield. Both Garen and Fiora want to strike as much as possible, and that's why I run lots of strike cards such as Single Combat and Concerting Strike. This striking synergy also benefits Radiant Guardian, which also wants to strike as it also heals you. Even though this received quite a big nerf this patch, it's still a fantastic card, and this is reflected by the fact that this deck is number 9 on the top 10 win rates. Since we want to run Bastion for Fiora and its insane value in general, we might as well play other power cards from Targon, such as the Infinite Mind Splitter and Solari Shield Bearer. It's quite an interesting take on the mid-range archetype, with also these kind of poshy, kind of flashy combo finishes in the form of Fiora. This archetype remains unchanged, however with patch 1.11, the increasing popularity of Targon and Hush, even though it was nerfed in the same patch. So this makes this archetype less consistent than it has been, as there's more basically unfavourable matchups now due to this kind of all these aggro ones popping up. You've seen this deck before in many forms, and I've opted for the one with 3 copies of Callista. The game plan is pretty simple: be as aggressive as possible as you can, and reduce your opponent's health to low as possible, and then burn them out with They Who Endure and Atrocity. Some notable additions from the new release are Doom Beast, Stalking Shadow, and Unspeakable Horror. This would probably be the Bomber TV go-to deck for climbing ranks right now, but just watch out for Hush, as this can crush your hopes and dreams if used on one of your cards like They Who Endure. Some lists in this archetype did run either Petty Officer or Yordle Grifter, so the win rate and a variety of is basically decreased a little bit this archetype, but it's still a very strong deck, basically meaning it can place in the top 10 on this list, even though there was patch 1.10 and 11 nerfs. So this is fallen down from 5th spot, that was in the last top 10 video. As a strangely low average mana cost for a control deck, with most cards costing between 2 and 3 mana. This is due to the deck being a mix of a burn and a control deck, It's a more expensive deck with actually 7 epics in total, which is way above average. This deck actually had at one stage the highest win rate in patch 1.8, and a variant of this featured in my previous top 10 video. Twisted Fate is a great card to stall either to AoE to a wide board, or to stun and set up removal for big threats, or even as a proactive move by drawing cards and discounting him. Swain is your finisher, but only if combined with the Leviathan, which is much more important than Swain himself, giving you a way to trigger easy Nexus damaging trigger effects basically. The other cards are pretty straightforward and basically just removal tools that you need to use in order to level up Swain. A notable card I want to talk about is Nocturne Guillotine, as it's so easy with this deck to deal damage to something using Twisted Fate's red card, or make it rain, to the point where you can spend a turn to remove their board, and given an average you're going to be removing something which costs more than 3 mana, you get the upper hand in that trade. Leviathan is much more important to draw rather than Swain, as Swain alone won't get through most of the times, and you'll just get the occasional stuns from Nexus damage spells, while the Leviathan, every turn you can stun half of your opponent's board, and Swain will easily connect, further destroying your opponent's board, even if it doesn't. The Leviathan will slowly and steadily kill your opponent, and it is such a fun way to win that Ray, effectively putting your opponent on a timer. Patch 1.11 did leave this deck unchanged and without proper buff to control strategies, and instead a nerf to Aurelion's soul. Aggro strategies have basically been dominating as a result, and we're going to see a lot of them as this list continues. The win rate of this deck has actually fallen quite a bit, and it was actually number 1 on the last top 10 list. Maybe this is due to the competition with all the other aggro decks. This deck is very aggressive and has a reflective average mana cost, with 32 cards costing 3 or below. This deck has a somewhat strange pace. You usually start the first turns by passing and banking mana, only to later unleash a ton of Nightfall threats. It's important to keep your Nightfall activators, which are Lunari Dustbringer, Solari Soldier, and Stalking Shadows, in your hands. These are Nightfall activators as they're the cards that don't actually have the Nightfall effect, therefore they get value out of being played first in a round, unlike most of the other cards in this deck. Fading Memories is by far the strongest Nightfall activator as it costs 0 mana. Even if you don't play the ally you're copying, 0 mana Nightfall triggers are insane, so therefore are times when even if you go first and you have a 1-drop, you could actually be passive, as this will translate to even more Nightfall triggers later on. Nightfall triggers are so valuable because the Nightfall effects can be devastating. Diana can remove 1 unit per attacking turn, whilst Nocturne should be used more as a finisher combined with other cheap units to make all blocking units unable to block fearsome, and basically deliver an unblockable one-shot. Every aggressive deck in Runeterra should have at least 1 bit of burn, and this role is filled perfectly by Doom Beast, Unspeakable Horror, and Atrocity. The last one is the best combined with Nocturne or a Nightfall buff Diana, so make sure you use Atrocity at the right time. Continue the streak of aggro decks, this deck was also left alone and untouched this balance, and instead increasing its ranking due to other aggressive archetypes receiving a nerf. Instead, the appeal of this one has basically kept the same. As a result, this deck has climbed from 10th to 5th place on this list. Discard aggro has seen a rebirth in the last couple of patches, and it's still a good contender even with the new Targon meta. It features cards from Noxus and Piltover and Zorn with an extremely low average cost, with crazy 12 cards costing just 1 mana. It features Draven and Jinx, which both utilise the discard mechanic. The deck got a nice addition with Poro Cannon, which both synergises the discard mechanics and gives you cheap elusive units to go wide with, which then you can turn buff, which makes it almost a very natural fit into this strategy. Also, the discard mechanic can also be used to help catch your opponent off guard with cards like Vision and Flame Chompers, where you're both at 0 mana, or where your opponent does not expect any reaction from you, so it can lead to some very extreme punishes. Other than that, the game plan has not changed from last season. Go wide early on cards thanks to Rummage, discarding cards like Jury Rig or Flame Chompers. Then buff your wide board thanks to Vision or Arena Battlecaster. Finally, when you're running out of steam, refill with Augmented Experimenter and bonus points if you can level up Jinx that way. So this is another aggro deck, and it's remained untouched in the patch, and it's increased its ranking due to the other ones receiving a tiny nerfs, as this one didn't involve Petty Officer. So this deck has a crazy amount of early game cards with just 3 decimates costing more than the 3 mana that all the other cards sit under. It's very budget, with no epic cards, and only actually 2 copies of Elise needed in this kind of version of the deck. The game plan is simple, just deal as much damage in the early game thanks to early game aggro cards like Legion Saboteur and Precious Pet. Then later on burn your opponent with burn spells such as Nox and Favor and Decimate. Elise should not be protected more than normal, just treat her like a normal unit while having your allies. In a basically game, when she levels up she's very strong, but don't be too protective to try and get this. Remember, this is an aggro deck and there's a lot of other very aggressive cards, so just don't put all your resources into saving her. Stalking Shadows is a particularly strong card to pick, and this also works well with Shadow Beast, just for when additional burn and kind of aggroness is needed. This is a very fast deck, both for winning and losing, but as long as your win rate is more than 50%, you're going to be climbing the ranks, aren't you? Patch 1.11 did nerf a very strong card in this deck, Petty Officer, but just with that small tweak, the strength of this archetype is pretty much unchanged. In fact, the fact it's basically top 3 on this win rate list says it all, that it's a very strong deck, even with the minor nerf. Pyro Aggro got more popular in the last stages of the last season, and it's still a worthy contender, as its burn capabilities work well against mid-range and control decks, and he still was a good matchup against aggro Miros. The cards in the deck are from Noxus and Build Wars, with a staggering 32 cards costing 3 or less. Misfortune will have a very hard time leveling up, and is here just as a more consistent way to level up Gangplank, to make your boards more threatening also when you attack. Gangplank can end the game against wide boards, and therefore making aggro Miro much easier, as we said previously. This deck has a lot of ways to end the game with burn, like the usual Crimson Disciple into Imperial Demolitionist, or burn dedicated spells like Nox and Favor and Decimate. This is a pretty solid deck, and a fast one, definitely a nice option to rank with, but as you will see, there are better options to go for aggro wise, so if you do like quick and aggressive decks, this may be the one for you, but keep watching. So both the nerf to Petty Officer and Yule Grifter has impacted the win rate of this archetype, which was still quite strong anyway, as its power cards such as Riptide Rex were unchanged in the balance updates. The win rate of this deck, when I did this best meta decks video, was 71.4%, so it's basically dropped by about 10%. Still, this is a huge win rate for a very powerful deck, hence it is number 2 on this win rate list. The deck has a very spread out mana cost, with most cards costing between 2 and 4 mana. It features cards from Buildwater and Noxus, and it's actually quite expensive, with a total of 11 epic cards in total. Twisted Fate Gangplank has seen a bit of a fall lately, but now with the rise of Lee Sin and the fall of some control decks such as Aurelion Soul or Tryndamere, Twisted Fate Gangplank is now the mid-range burn deck which can compete with all the popular decks right now. Aggros such as Pyro Aggro or combo decks, which we'll see later on, so it's actually very viable in today's meta. The deck has a lot of ways to counter multiple archetypes, either dealing damage early on, or challenging the board against some other aggressive decks, with units such as Jagged Butcher and Petty Officer. Against aggro in particular, you have lots of ways to nuke their board with AoE such as Make It Rain and Twisted Fate's red card. You will also have lots of options of dealing damage on single threats with removals such as Death's Hand or Nox and Favor. All those removals deal extra damage to the Nexus, so that's why this deck can shift into burn mood against control, for example. It also has a lot of power cards and win conditions, so mainly Twisted Fate, Gangplank, Riptide Rex, and Captain Farron. And this deck has been meta for quite a while now, and it has incredible win rate. Basically shows for itself it's a deck that is going to be good against the other decks out there. Elise has seen a lot of play in the last weeks after the buff of 1.10, and it gets an additional buff in 1.11 thanks to the buff of Bastion. This deck features cards from Targon and Iona, and a crazy 25 cards cost 2 or 3 mana. It's actually fairly expensive with 6 epic cards in the deck in total. So now the deck also wants to run Zed, as its main weakness is now solved by the incredible protection granted by Bastion. The main combo is to give Overwhelm to Leafanx thanks to Zenith Blade, so when he levels up he can deal both damage from his Dragon's Rage and his normal attack thanks to Overwhelm, basically dealing double unblockable damage most of the times, leading to a 0 KO. You can add to this Overwhelm damage using gem buffs from Mountain Goat and Mentor of the Stones. You can use other defensive units such as Eye of the Dragon and cheap tricks such as Guiding Touch and Pale Cascade as well to make the game flow in basically the way you want to basically do this combo to finish with. This deck also has very high win rates against aggro matchups, making this a deck all-rounder, weak only to bad draws. I can already guess a lot of you are expecting to see aggro decks pop up on this list, but are you surprised to see how little Aurelion Souls on the list? Are you surprised at the number of Lee Sin decks on this list, or where it appears on this list? Please leave that in a comment, I'd love to hear. The data presented here is analysed from mobile analytics by Bomber TV. He's a Masters tier player with a background in game theory and game design. He took the most winning archetypes into consideration from the Master tier, excluding ones with small play rates, and analysed their key properties on why they are so strong. Please check him out. Which decks are you having the most luck with so far in patch 1.11? Please leave these in the comments, I'd love to hear where you're having success. Up next is Best Meta Decks Patch 1.11, taking a deeper dive into the best decks currently being used in the game this patch. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.